Good day, this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Montreal, Canada for Reason to Resist on January 4th, 2026. Was Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro betrayed? That's one of the questions we'll address today with our guest, José Luis Granados Ceja. José Luis is a journalist and political analyst based in Mexico City. He's co-founder of the Soberanía podcast, the Mexican politics podcast, and a contributor to Dropsite News for Latin America. Thank you very much for joining us again, José Luis.
Thanks so much for the invitation. Always a pleasure to be here with you, Dimitri.
And as I said before we got on this interview, that I wish it were in better circumstances, but I couldn't think of anyone better than you to provide insight into what has happened, these extraordinary events in Venezuela and the broader region over the past 48 hours. So before we get into it, José Luis, I just want to remind our audience to like and share this video if they find it informative. And if you're not a subscriber to Reason to Resist, we warmly encourage you to become one, help us to expand the reach of our unapologetic resistance journalism. And I understand if you hit the bell icon, you can get notifications of our individual videos. So we encourage you to do that as well. So let's get into it, José Luis. I'd like to begin with the question of betrayal, or the possibility of it. Many of us have now seen video of U.S. helicopters swooping into Caracas at low altitude. And there's no indication in the brief video clip that I've been able to see of this, that these helicopters were fired upon by Venezuelan air defense systems. And apparently they have significant air defense capability in Venezuela. So here's one of the videos, maybe the one that is most eye-popping for those of us who are not, like me, military experts. So there you saw video of numerous U.S. helicopters flying into Caracas, explosions on the ground. Many of them were visible in the clip, but I did not see a single air defense missile or anti-aircraft battery engaging with any of these helicopters. Again, I'm not a military expert, but I have seen literally hundreds of these videos during the course of the wars in West Asia and the war in Ukraine over the last several years. And it's quite notable, there was absolutely nothing there indicating engagement by air defense systems. Now, at the same time, during a press conference yesterday with the Donald, U.S. General Dan Kane made some interesting statements about Venezuelan air defenses. Here's what he had to say.
Began to approach Caracas, the joint air component began dismantling and disabling the air defense systems in Venezuela, employing weapons to ensure the safe passage of the helicopters into the target area. The goal of our air component was, and always will be to protect the helicopters and the ground force and get them to the target and get them home. As the force crossed the last point of high terrain, we had been hiding in the clutter. We assessed that we had maintained totally the element of surprise. As the helicopter force ingressed towards the objective at low level, we arrived at Maduro's compound at 1:01 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, or 2:01 a.m. Caracas local time, and the apprehension force descended into Maduro's compound and moved with speed, precision, and discipline towards their objective, and isolated the area to ensure the safety and security of the ground force while apprehending the indicted persons. On arrival into the target area, the helicopters came under fire, and they replied with that fire with overwhelming force in self-defense.
Okay, so a few highlights there. And of course, all or much of that may have been complete BS. We don't know. I'm in no position to say whether any of that was untrue. But what he's claiming, first of all, is that there was suppression of the air defenses using America's technical capability. Presumably the U.S. military, with all that money they spend, they have, impressive abilities vis-a-vis suppression of air defense systems, blocking GPS and so forth. And he does say that they were engaged. He says that, they were fired upon. Again, we don't know whether that's true, but he's acknowledging there was resistance. And but the other part that strikes me as troubling about this is that they say that not a single U.S. soldier was killed. And when you think about sending all of that military force into the capital, which was presumably the most heavily defended city in Venezuela, and they had months of warning that the U.S. might try to pull a stunt like this, sending special forces into the capital or elsewhere in the country, it seems remarkable that not a single U.S. soldier would be killed if there was meaningful resistance to the military operation. So again, and I readily acknowledge, José Luis, we are all operating with imperfect information here, but you come from the region, you're an astute observer of the politics of the region, and particularly the left-wing governments, such as that of the Chavistas in Venezuela. What is your view about what happened here? Does it seem to you that there was some betrayal? And if so, who do you think are the prime suspects?
So I'll start by saying I don't think there was a betrayal. I don't think that this was some kind of palace coup, with different power brokers inside of the Bolivarian government conspiring secretly with Washington. I think the history of the Bolivarian Revolution and some of the personalities involved, I think, give us plenty of evidence to suggest that they would not be capable of that level of betrayal, which is essentially treason. I do think that it's also important to mention that the war against Venezuela by the United States has always been a hybrid war. And a hybrid war has a huge element of psychological warfare to it. So we should be very dubious of what the United States is telling us, particularly in these press conferences like the one that we just watched, which are for mostly a domestic audience. I will say as well that there was plenty of evidence. I saw on Telesur, the journalist Madeline Garcia, who has very close connections with the armed forces inside of Venezuela, touring La Carlota Air Base, showing the burned out missile batteries, air defense systems. So I don't want to ever overstate the U.S. capacity. I think often they try to sell themselves as invulnerable, but they are very powerful. And this is a very, very large armed force with a lot of capabilities. We're talking about, the Pentagon spending $1 trillion a year. This is no small amount of money, and it gives them an extraordinary amount of capacity to be able to not only deploy, but develop. And so there's a lot of technology that many of us may not even be aware of that the United States is capable of employing. They talked about them shutting down the power grid. That's likely a cyber attack, a high-level one. And, Venezuela's system is quite vulnerable as a result of the decade-long campaign against them, the sanctions over the more recent years that have made it very difficult to be able to maintain that system. In the best of times, they experience brownouts and blackouts. So it's a very vulnerable system. Likewise, its defense systems have experienced some vulnerability as a result of this sanctions campaign, which has made it very difficult to have the resources and even have access to the parts. While some of this equipment comes from countries that are not friendly to Washington, a lot of what they had before the arrival of Hugo Chavez is equipment from the United States, and they simply refuse to sell them parts or give them the know-how necessary to repair their equipment. So it's quite likely also that Venezuela's readiness was significantly reduced for these economic reasons as well. And so, when you put this all together, it also helps us to see that there really was a very quick action by the United States. They moved very, very, very fast. And being able to kind of carry out this operation the way that they did was probably a surprise even to, the head of the armed forces of Venezuela, Padrino. It seems to me that they did successfully take out their air defense systems rather quickly. There was evidence beforehand, and I've read reports that some of these Growler jets, which are high-tech equipment used by the U.S. Navy precisely or for this kind of electronic warfare, they were already present in the Caribbean, and it's believed that they were involved in this most recent operation. There's also lots of evidence that they've already been using some of this, scrambling technology. There were 2 near mid-air collisions between U.S. military jets and passenger planes in and around the area around Maiquetía, the airport there near Caracas. in the lead up to all of this. And so we knew they were using GPS scrambling. We know that they were affecting the electronic grid. We know that Venezuela's capacities were reduced, and that the United States spends a lot on its military, and that they do have the capacity to carry out this kind of action with these kinds of results, where there isn't any casualties on the US side. But there were casualties on the Venezuelan side. It's believed that at least 40 people were killed. In fact, there were actual hits on civilian buildings. There was a report from the Ministry of Health from Venezuela saying that one of the warehouses of medical equipment was hit by these strikes. And so, as much as the United States also talks about precision strikes, the same way the Zionist entity does, we know that they're not that precise, and that they also miss as well. And so all of this together tells me that this narrative that it was a betrayal and that actually they allowed Maduro to be captured doesn't really add up, and I believe is part of the psychological warfare operation.
So the Donald was actually quite more explicit about the vice president Delcy Rodriguez's willingness to take orders from Washington, and here's what he had to say during yesterday's press conference.
Thank you. Are you saying that Secretary Hegseth and Rubio are going to be running Venezuela, and will you be sending in U.S. military troops to provide?
They're going to be a team that's working with the people of Venezuela to make sure that we have Venezuela right. Because for us to just leave, who's going to take over? I mean, there is nobody to take over. You have a vice president who's been appointed by Maduro, and right now she's the vice president, and she's, I guess, the president. She was sworn as president just a little while ago. She had a long conversation with Marco, and she said, we'll do whatever you need. I think she was quite gracious, but she really doesn't have a choice. We're going to have this done right.
What was interesting there, José Luis, is that when he was repeating what Delcy Rodriguez supposedly said to Rubio, he paused, and there was a long pause, and then he said, need. So it seemed like Donald was trying to figure out in real time what he was going to say to people about the conversation. But he's, for what it's worth, Donald Trump, the pathological liar, is claiming that Delcy Rodriguez has declared her intention to take orders from Washington. What do you make of this? And please talk to us, in explaining your position about who Delcy Rodriguez is. I had something to say about this yesterday. I was in Venezuela as an election observer last year. I heard Delcy Rodriguez speak on a couple of occasions. I came away from those interactions, reasonably impressed by her. But I think you probably know much more about her background than I do. So I'm curious to hear what you have to say about this claim that Trump is making.
I don't doubt for a second that she was in communication with Rubio. I think in the moment, having the president kidnapped the way that he was, where his whereabouts were not even known at that moment, likely her priority was for an end to the aggression, to pause the attack that was ongoing in that moment. And as the most reasonable person to talk to, given she is the executive vice president, it makes sense. I think a lot of us abroad can often, pump our chests out and talk about the need to resist and things like that, but we're not the ones who are actually ultimately accountable for the lives that will be lost, which there were already by that point, and I'm sure she had the reports of it, to put even more Venezuelan lives on the line. And so I imagine that there was a conversation about what needs to happen for this to end. And Trump himself said it in that same press conference, that they had a second wave of attack, an apparently larger attack, at the ready, and likely transmitted that to Delcy in that moment to tell her, if you don't, you're about to be bombed even more. And given the fact that this first operation managed to, as we just finished describing, basically take out their defenses, it would have been a very difficult moment. And the speed of everything, the military doctrine of Venezuela is one that's based on a combination of the regular armed forces, but also the militia and the armed grassroots organizations to provide defense of the territory. It takes time to activate those, even though they were at the ready. I don't think they would have been able to deploy them quickly enough to face another attack. All that being said, I don't think that his claim that she's ready to do whatever Washington says adds up, again, given the fact that we understand how long she has been an important member of the Bolivarian revolutionary leadership. She and her brother Jorge Rodriguez are very important figures in the Bolivarian Revolution. in Venezuela, the vice president isn't elected. The person is tapped by the president. Maduro, like Chavez before him, was elected somebody to be his number two. Maduro had tapped Delcy Rodriguez to be his executive vice president. And, I trust his judgment and in terms of picking her over other important actors, for example, like Diosdado Cabello, who's also a very key Chavista figure in Venezuela. And so her also personal history, I think, is important to mention. Her father was killed by the Venezuelan state that was backed by the United States at the time. So this is somebody who comes from a very long tradition of revolutionary struggle, who has proven her commitment to the Bolivarian Revolution throughout, and I think understands that if she is seen as somebody who's now going to do Washington's bidding because of the balance of forces in the country, that she would be understood to be a traitor, to betray the revolution. And we also have to understand, I've made this point on other programs, which is that this is a revolutionary situation. So by that, I mean, this isn't just people passive in their participation in politics in the country. We're talking about millions of people who've been deeply engaged with it that wouldn't tolerate a betrayal. And if they see Delcy as being someone who's not living up to the legacy of Hugo Chavez, then I think the people themselves would look to make a change at the leadership. She also has to proceed very, very carefully. There are a lot of power interests inside of Venezuela. There are people that very much rely on their connections to the state in order to be able to kind of carry out their economic activities. So she has to strike a very careful balance with all of these different actors. Some of them, like I said, are sort of the bourgeoisie that does exist still in Venezuela, that still commands an important part of the Venezuelan economy. There's the oil interests and all of the players that are connected to kind of the secondary market related to the oil interests. There's the armed forces and there's the grassroots. So all of these things are very difficult. One of the kind of most outstanding features of Hugo Chavez, and in particular, actually maybe to a heightened degree of Nicolás Maduro, has been their ability to kind of navigate and balance all of these different interests and all of the different, structural reasons for them to want to advocate for this or that. For example, with the unilateral course of measures campaign, the sanctions against Venezuela, there have been a lot of concessions to this bourgeoisie that does still remain in Venezuela. Have been a lot of concessions to basically keep the economy afloat in the face of the economic crisis that was imposed on them. But that stands, for example, in contrast to the grassroots left-wing socialist communist forces, which disagree with some of these concessions. And so Maduro was always very good at kind of figuring out how to give enough to everybody to keep that coalition together, particularly in the face of an opposition that is anti-democratic and backed by U.S. imperialism. Mm-hmm. So this is, I think, the biggest challenge for Delcy. And if she's not able to manage it, somebody else is going to have to rise to the occasion. Of course, she's also have to figure out what happens next. So because this happened at the beginning of Maduro's term, it's difficult to say exactly what the Supreme Court is going to decide. So far at this moment, they've obviously now recognized her as the acting president because the actual democratically elected president is not able to exercise functions given that he is now in detention inside of the United States. What happens next is there's going to have to be a new election, right? The Venezuelan constitution doesn't necessarily allow for a vice president to hold that seat if half of the period hasn't been served yet. And so, that means that there's going to have to be decisions made in terms of how to legitimize her place at the head of the executive. All of these things are really quite tricky for her, I think, in terms of navigating all of this. And of course, there is the U.S. element. The U.S. is going to put tremendous pressure on Venezuela now. And he said as much, Trump, in his press conference, saying, if you don't do what we say, we're just going to do what we did to Maduro to you. And that's a very terrifying notion. They just proved that they can't. So again, this is something that she's also going to have to take into account as she picks up the pieces left by this U.S. attack on Venezuela.
You just listening to you remind there's certain constitutional irony to this, because as I recall, when the West claimed that this clown Juan Guaido was the true president of Venezuela, whatever happened to good old Juan Guaido, they were citing a provision of the Venezuelan constitution which addressed the absence of the president. And they claimed that Maduro was absent because he hadn't actually been validly elected. I think that was back in 2019. So now I would imagine that they're relying upon that the Venezuelan authorities are relying upon that very same constitutional provision to legitimize the installation of the vice president, a Chavista, into power. In any case, I wanted to show you another clip from this press conference, which is relevant to the question of what will Delcy Rodriguez do now. And here's what Trump had to say when he was asked about putting boots on the ground in Venezuela.
President, does the U.S. running the country mean that U.S. troops will be on the ground? How will that work?
Well, you know, they always say boots on the ground. Oh, so we're not afraid of boots on the ground if we have to have. We had boots on the ground last night at a very high level, actually. We're not afraid of it. We don't mind saying it. But we're going to make sure that that country is run properly. We're not doing this in vain. This is a very dangerous attack. This is an attack that could have gone very, very badly. Could have gone very badly. We could have lost a lot of people last night. We could have lost a lot of dignity. We could have lost a lot of equipment. The equipment is less important, but we could have lost a lot. And we're going to make sure that this is proper. We're there now. We're ready to go again if we have to.
And to me, that's really the key part of that excerpt. We're ready to go again if we have to. We're going to run the country. So he's, I think, quite clearly threatening additional military force if Delcy Rodriguez doesn't take orders. And as I'm sure you saw, and none of us were surprised by this, Trump placed great emphasis in the press conference on the exploitation of Venezuela's massive oil reserves, the largest proven oil reserves in the world. So my question to you is now, if I'm sitting in Delcy Rodriguez's position, I'm listening to all of this, I'm thinking about the damage that's been done to our air defenses. I might be inclined to think I'm going to have to make some concessions to the U.S. government when it comes to Venezuela's oil industry in order to avoid further aggression. If I don't do that, I can anticipate that they're coming back in. What do you think is likely to happen? I realize this is a hard thing for you to judge, José Luis, you know, predicting how all of this will play out. Do you think that Delcy Rodriguez is going to ultimately make concessions or be forced to make concessions with respect to the exploitation of Venezuela's oil resources to the U.S. oil industry?
The thing is that Venezuela has already been making concessions. You know, they're not in a position to kind of carry out the same investment in its oil industry that they were at the beginning of the Bolivarian Revolution, at the beginning of the century. So this is actually an ongoing thing. And in fact, a lot of what is being talked about now is essentially the deal that was apparently offered by the Rodriguez in Qatar to the United States. Now, there's some speculation as to whether or not that's actually, you know, it was a valid proposal that was being made, but it was basically that we can find a new understanding between us. You can invest here. U.S. oil companies can invest here as long as they respect Venezuelan laws. In fact, that has always been the case. You know, there was an important hydrocarbon law that spooked a lot of U.S. oil companies, and here I'm thinking about ExxonMobil, but other ones like Chevron said, no, we'll work with the Venezuelan authorities. Our interest is in extracting oil, taking our part, and paying our royalties. So, you know, this notion that, you know, the ingress of U.S. oil company capital in order to rebuild the industry is not something that would actually necessarily be a break with existing policy today of the Venezuelan government. And in fact, they kind of need it. There's really no other place for them to be able to secure the necessary capital to rebuild the industry in this moment. And so if there is in the future, you know, an announcement that ExxonMobil is going back to Venezuela now under these terms, as long as they respect Venezuelan law, it's not necessarily outside of, you know, policy that the Bolivarian Revolution has always had, especially given the relatively weakened position they now find themselves in with reduced capacities for the defense of the territory. And I think above all, that's kind of the priority now. Mm-hmm. Whoever the leader of Venezuela is now has to consider that the challenge is maintaining Venezuela as a viable independent state. You know, I do think that there are people in Washington who aren't interested in regime change anymore, but actually regime collapse. You know, there was a very interesting essay about the 12-day war against Iran that suggests by Elie Terrenoir that said that that was actually the goal, to make it so that it's just not a viable state anymore, that the whole country starts to kind of break along sectarian lines and divisions, and that you can't even kind of defend your own territory or your borders. You know, there are people who want to do that to Venezuela. And so I think Delcy's also have to consider, how do I avoid that kind of scenario? Now, what Trump is talking about is control over the oil fields, U.S. administration of the oil fields. I do think that that's a step too far. I do think that if we start seeing that, that would constitute a betrayal. And I don't expect that to happen. Also, because we're talking again about a country that wouldn't tolerate that. You know, so much has been sacrificed to protect its natural resources. They're not going to just simply hand them over now. And it does imply to me that if Trump is serious about U.S. administration of Venezuela's resources, it's going to require an occupation. It's going to require, as he said, boots on the ground. And as he just said as well, he's willing to do it. Now, that's a very different scenario. That's now occupation. That is foreign boots on your soil. That's going to provoke a reaction. And even if there are state actors who are willing to tolerate that, again, I want to emphasize that there are revolutionary actors on the ground that won't. And so that means if this scenario plays out, what you will see is sabotage of the industry. They will not allow the United States to steal the resources as they seem to intend that they want to do. Mm-hmm. So it's this, like you said, it's very difficult to predict what's going to happen. But I do think that the number one concern should be about the actual integrity of Venezuela as a nation state, because that's the stakes. And in fact, that's a fight that, once again, Venezuela's on the front lines, because if they're successful in actually undermining that, that could become a problem for the entire region. That would be the aim of U.S. imperialism moving forward, to just destroy states, take the parts that you need in order to have access to these resources and this labor and all of this that the U.S. imperialism needs in order to be able to continue to, you know, compete for global hegemony with its peer rival China, for example. And so I think a lot of that also has to be on her mind and the remaining leadership. So it's very, like I said, it is really difficult to see what is going to happen next, but the stakes could not be bigger.
A moment ago, you said that ExxonMobil was spooked by the hydrocarbon law. Was it simply that ExxonMobil thought that the royalties it would be required to pay were too high, or was there something else about this law that spooked this evil corporation?
I think actually they found that they would rather avoid Venezuela and be active in Guyana instead. So Guyana, this disputed territory, the Essequibo, with Venezuela, right off of the coast of that disputed territory, there are massive oil reserves. And in fact, at this point, they are producing around 1 million barrels a day, which is almost, or in fact, more than what Venezuela is producing today. So they said, well, why would we deal with the socialists in Venezuela when we can just basically buy off the entire Guyanese government, which they effectively have. Guyana is an extension of ExxonMobil today. It's tragic for those people and the people of Guyana who should be enjoying this wealth, but instead it's being all shipped out and into the coffers of ExxonMobil for them to engage in the oil exploration and extraction there. And so I think that's part of it. And in fact, ExxonMobil has played a really big part in really driving up the tensions between Guyana and Venezuela, trying to provoke an incident to allow them to leverage that in a future moment to say, oh, then now that Venezuela is no longer governed by our adversaries, we can go back in.
So yesterday's press conference featured some eye-popping commentary from the Donald about Maria Corina Machado. You know, many of us, and I profess to be one of them, thought that when she was given the Nobel Peace Prize, this supporter of Israel's genocidal regime, that this was a prelude to her being installed as the next president of Venezuela. You know, my interpretation was that the U.S. government had pressured the Nobel Committee into giving her the prize to sort of legitimize her and to cloak her with, you know, the saintliness of a peace prize before she was installed in power. But then yesterday he was asked about Machado, Trump, and this is what he said.
Of opposition leader Machado, and have you been in contact with her?
No, we haven't. No, we haven't.
Mr. President, on Monday.
Oh, I think it would be very tough for her to be the leader. She doesn't have the support within or the respect within the country. She's a very nice woman, but she doesn't have the respect.
Mr. President, is it possible that the U.S. and
Yeah, so this very nice supporter of Israel's genocide, he hasn't even been in contact with her, he claims. Wow, what do you make of that, José Luis?
You know, I'd done a lot of media appearances before everything that happened on the night of January 3rd. But in those media appearances, I actually always emphasize that Maria Corina Machado is not that popular of a figure. In fact, she's pretty marginal. She was very, very unpopular for the vast majority of her political career in Venezuela. She obviously has a very high profile now. And like you, I thought when they gave her the Nobel Peace Prize, the point was to elevate it even more, to make her seem like the leader in waiting if there was a coup, a strike, a decapitation, or, you know, all the rest of it. But Trump actually told the truth just there, is that she is not actually a tremendously popular figure. She's not actually have the trust, nor does she have the capacity to actually bring together the country, given all the stuff that I said at in my first response about all of the different power brokers inside of Venezuela, that I don't think she has the capacity to actually be able to kind of bring together and hold the coalition together and actually be able to govern, not to mention all of the resistance that she would find from, again, these grassroots revolutionary forces that would not tolerate Maria Corina Machado as the leader. And so I'm, in a sense, grateful that he said that, because that's the truth of it. You know, there is this really famous exchange between Corina Machado and Chavez, where she tries to confront him over the expropriations. And he says, you're out of ranking, you know, go win the nomination for the opposition primary, and then maybe we can have a debate, because an eagle doesn't hunt a fly. And they basically said the same thing to her from Mar-a-Lago, saying, you're out of ranking here. And that's the truth of it. And she was never going to be able to successfully govern the country, even if she found herself in a position to. Not to mention that she wasn't even the candidate in the last election. The opposition candidate was Edmundo González, who is, you know, this former diplomat with actually a very dark history of activities as when he was as a diplomat, who's, you know, of such an advanced age that he wasn't even able to campaign, right? He basically lived out in his apartment the entire campaign, and she did all of the campaigning for him. So anyway, she doesn't have even a claim to the presidency. She did mention at one point that Edmundo had said that she would be his vice president and all the rest of it. So, you know, for once we heard from the United States the truth about that. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that the U.S. government has worked very closely with the Venezuelan opposition for decades. In fact, Maria Corina Machado kind of emerged out of nowhere when I believe it was USAID, but it could have been State Department funding, really channeled money to her organization, which is called Sumate, to promote a recall referendum. She was invited to the White House. There's a famous picture of her smiling ear to ear next to George W. Bush. You know, she's always kind of been a creature of Washington. But I was saying, and so I finally said the part out loud about, you know, the Venezuelan opposition has always overpromised and underdelivered to the U.S. government, saying, no, there are the top brass of the military is ready to break with Maduro and all the rest of this kind of claims that ultimately never came through. You know, there was the uprising led by Guaido and Leopoldo Lopez, right after his, you know, he claimed to be the president, that petered out. But they had told the White House that they were going to successfully have a coup d'etat. And so, you know, they've been burned so many times that it's interesting to see how little they trust them today.
You know, the remarkable thing now, just realizing this now, is that during that, it was almost an hour long, that press conference, they didn't even mention the candidate, the main opposition candidate to Nicolás Maduro in last year's election. And they were claiming until they were blue in the face that he was in fact the legitimate president. Now he doesn't even merit a mention. Only Machado does, and she was dismissed, swatted away like a fly.
I bet if you asked Trump if he knew his name, he wouldn't be able to tell you.
Absolutely. So let's talk now, José Luis, about the reaction of other governments in the region. I want to start with Mexico. And I'm going to put up on the screen here a statement issued by the Mexican government. Oh, it looks like I've got the Spanish version.
I can translate it for you if you want.
If you could just give us a summary of what it says here.
Yeah. The government of Mexico condemns and rejects energetically the military actions executed unilaterally in the last few hours by the armed forces of the United States of America against objectives in the territory of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, in a clear violation of Article 2 of the Charter of the Organization of the United Nations. So you can see it there. I mean, that basically, the first paragraph says it all, right? Condemns and rejects the actions of the United States inside of Venezuela and called on the UN to take action. In fact, that's been Mexico's line throughout. The UN needs to step up. Unfortunately, I think that's a bit of a misplaced hope, to be honest. I understand that Sheinbaum is interested in uplifting multilateral organizations. That is part of her political vision for the world. But I think the UN has proven how useless it is. I think not just only in this circumstance, but really historically. And of course, most recently, it allowed a genocide to take place in 2025, you know? And I think that tells us everything we need to know about the capacity of the UN to actually be an actor. The UN Secretary General Gutierrez had a terrible statement calling on both parties as if Venezuela had been guilty of anything other than being the victim of a U.S. aggression. And it needed to be said. The U.S. just violated the Charter of the United Nations, and this is clearly an illegal act that is contrary to international law. But even then, when it's clear as day to any kind of observer, you don't need to be a legal expert to see that this is clearly illegal, couldn't muster the courage to do it. The OAS, same thing. The statement from the Secretary General was pathetic. And in fact, we saw a statement from the fact-finding mission that is a body of the United Nations in relation to Venezuela. In fact, going to the contrary. Sure, they had some words in there condemning the U.S. actions, but really they spent most of their time in their statement criticizing Venezuela and talking about the need for justice for the alleged human rights violations that had happened. It's extraordinary. There is no higher human rights violation than an invasion, than the sequester, the kidnapping of a president. And they're worried about, allegations from a number of years ago that the Venezuelan state may or may not have committed as it tried to protect itself against an insurrectionary strategy that was backed by the largest army in the world.
Yeah. The Nuremberg trials, as you probably know, José Luis, described the crime of aggression, which is clearly what this is, as the crime of crimes. The ultimate crime in international law. Even The Guardian, which really hates the Chavista movement, has been forced to admit over the last several days. I've been reading their reporting on this. They've been citing international law experts. They can't find one who won't condemn this as a blatant violation of the core principles of the UN Charter.
Even the New York Times editorials, it was surprisingly... it was what it was. It had its issues, of course, but I thought that it would, be more embracing of this, given, likewise, their support for U.S. regime change efforts in Venezuela historically. We have to remember, outlets like The Time were the ones who promoted the lie that Venezuela burned the humanitarian aid at the bridge during that incident. It was until months later, when nobody was paying attention anymore, did they finally admit that they got their coverage wrong. It's the New York Times that was the one that propagated that lie about widespread sexual assaults during October 7th against, the operation, the flood, led by Hamas, right? That they still haven't retracted, even though it's been disproven. And yet, even then, their editorial board said this was a step too far.
Right. So let's talk now about Colombia. Gustavo Petro, the president of Colombia, was rather less diplomatic in his language today in describing what happened. And he, in this clip here, I'll just show you a summary of it by Kyle Kulinski. He said, quote, "A clan of pedophiles wants to destroy our democracy. To keep Epstein's list from coming out, they send warships to kill fishermen and threaten our neighbor with invasion for their oil," close quote. I must commend Gustavo Petro not only for his honesty, because this may very well have something to do with distracting people from the Jeffrey Epstein scandal, but his courage in using this language, with the notoriously irascible Donald Trump. And I guess my question to you, José Luis, it's not only vis-a-vis Colombia that I ask you this question. I'm also even raising the possibility of Mexico or even Brazil, Lula in Brazil. I mean, if Trump gets away with this in the sense that he has, committed the crime of aggression with absolutely no consequences, and there's no reason to believe that UN Security Council will be able to impose any consequences, why wouldn't he escalate against other left-leaning governments in the region? And I would think that Colombia would be a prime target. Certainly also there's Cuba, there's Nicaragua, plenty of targets there for this lunatic to pursue. What do you think he's going to do? Won't he be encouraged now, if there's no penalty for this, to target other governments in the region?
Absolutely. He's going to be incredibly emboldened. In fact, I would say the lack of a serious pushback, especially from Latin America, is what got us to this point. In fact, it was the extrajudicial executions that got no pushback in the Caribbean and in the Eastern Pacific. His blatant interference in Argentina and its electoral process, his open, blatant call for support for one candidate in Honduras in the most recent elections. So we've seen case after case of the U.S. really, really stretching that rubber band to the breaking point, to now even an invasion and the kidnapping of a president. And you're right. I don't think there's going to be much of a pushback here. And so not only will U.S. imperialism be emboldened, but so will the right-wing actors in this region. They probably feel like they can get away with everything. Who's going to stop them? Who's going to stand up to them? Where is the line going to be drawn? Because it hasn't been clearly drawn. There's supposed to be an emergency session of the CELAC today, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, which is the alternative to the OAS. The OAS is also having a session. I have zero faith in them. Don't even want to waste my time. Maybe I'll read the press release that comes of it. But the CELAC is an important space. But unfortunately, it operates under consensus. So now all of these right-wing leaders in the region are just going to be spoilers. They're just going to be there to try to prevent any kind of regional unity. And I think that's the challenge today. Because you're right. What's next is Cuba and Nicaragua and Colombia and Mexico, and especially Mexico. Sheinbaum made her statement. She was later asked by a reporter in the middle of the day to kind of elaborate on it, and specifically around Trump's comments, who said something has to be done about Mexico. When he was asked about, well, is this a message to other countries? Because, of course, the excuse was drugs, right? Fentanyl. Fentanyl kills so many people, et cetera, et cetera. Well, fentanyl doesn't come from Venezuela. It comes from Mexico, mostly. And it comes as a result of, the U.S. making it difficult for the precursors to arrive directly from China. And as long as the demand is there, the smugglers will find a way to get the drugs into the United States so that they can be sold and they can be consumed. Really, the problem is on their end. But that doesn't take anything away from the fact that fentanyl comes from Mexico, a little bit from Canada, but mostly from here. And so does that mean that now he has the excuse? Apparently, it's a weapon of mass destruction, according to the U.S. government, according to Trump. So now is he going to attack Mexico in the same way? Is he going to accuse Claudia Sheinbaum of being controlled by the cartels? He already says the country is. It's not, but that's his claim. It's really quite disturbing to see his response also. He always says, oh, Claudia Sheinbaum is afraid of the cartels. I keep offering to take them out. And she never accepts. No, Mr. President. That's his understanding of it. Honestly, I think he just, in his brain, isn't able to wrap his head around what it means to defend sovereignty, what it means to actually exercise the defense of sovereignty, because that's what Sheinbaum's doing. It's not that she's afraid of the cartels and that's why she doesn't want U.S. support to take them out. In fact, her government is doing a very good job using intelligence, going after the money that supplies them, going after the guns that allow them to be as violent as they are, and actually bringing down the violent crime in this country successfully. And the evidence is there now. She doesn't need the U.S.'s help, but this is the way he frames it. And so will he say, well, she's afraid because she's in cahoots with him, and therefore I'm going to fly in and kidnap her and bring her to New York to face trial? I mean, the precedent has been set. And so now the region really has to think about what it means to reckon without the fallout of what just happened. And that means that if the CELAC today is not able to come to a position to actually condemn what happened, and I don't think they will, because, there are actors in this region like Bukele who've already warmly embraced what happened, then there has to be some kind of alternative. Maybe an ad hoc group of the countries that are willing, and some of the heavyweights like Brazil, like Mexico, some of these larger countries, larger economies, Colombia in there as well, that actually represent a majority of the population here in the region. That's all that's left, because otherwise the entire possibility of actually exercising sovereignty is not longer going to be possible. I mean, these are the stakes. I know I keep using that word, but this wasn't just an attack on Venezuela. It was an attack on all of Latin America. And it should be perceived as a threat to the sovereignty of each and every single one of the states that make up Latin America. And the reason I bring this up is that the United States is not going to desist. They can't be talked out of this because there are structural reasons behind it. The hypothesis that I have been putting forward is that the United States is in a strategic retreat. I call it a strategic retreat because they used to talk about total spectrum dominance following the end of the Cold War, that the United States had no rivals, that they were the only superpower. But that's no longer the case today because they have a peer rival in China. And in fact, I think the National Security Strategy document confesses that they know this. Even Marco Rubio, when he was senator, talked about how we now live in a multipolar world. And so that means that they have to figure out how they can actually compete for global hegemony under these new circumstances. And for me, the way that they seem to want to actually be able to put themselves in a position, not today, but in the future, to be able to compete for global hegemony, to actually be able to defeat China if there is a direct conflict, is by turning to their traditional spheres of influence. Western Europe, Japan, Australia, and largely all of those are already in the US camp. Europe in particular likes to pretend that it has an independent foreign policy. It doesn't. I think the reaction from the spokesperson for the EU's foreign policy makes it clear as day that they're not actually going to oppose this in a serious way. So what does that leave? That mostly leaves Latin America. They've always viewed Latin America as their backyard. I mean, it's a term that makes me want to throw up, but that is the way that they view things. Even Biden with his stupid comment, it's not our backyard, it's our front yard. No, it's nobody's yard. Go screw yourself. But this is how they view it. And because they view it as this, that means they're going to do everything and anything to exercise their dominance over this region. And that part worries me because they will clearly do just about anything. And maybe even we may even see more kinds of aggressions like the ones we saw against Venezuela. And that's really a risk because this region is in dispute. It's not like we're ready and willing to hand our resources over or, our territories. There is still widespread conviction in this part of the world, even though we've seen some right-wing governments succeed electorally, for more welfare, less inequality, a better distribution of the country's resources. Certainly here in Mexico, after, in 2018, after the election of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, we finally got a view of what it's like to have a government that redistributes this country's wealth and actually puts it into people's pockets, lifting people out of poverty, right? This is what people want. And even in some of these countries where we've seen right-wing rule, like Noboa in Ecuador, he recently tried to change the constitution to allow U.S. bases into his country, and that was rejected. It was actually the referendum question with the highest rejection. And so there's still an animus here to say no to U.S. imperialism, to say yes to redistribution of wealth. Maybe we're not talking about socialism of the 21st century anymore in this moment. That can always change. But this region is under dispute, which means that if the U.S. wants to exert dominance over us, it's going to be a violent affair. That's the part that scares me.
Let's talk about what resistance might look like here. Let's suppose that the governments of the left-leaning governments of the region, and I'm thinking principally of, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Nicaragua, Cuba, perhaps, I don't know where Bolivia is nowadays, but let's suppose that they say, okay, we are going to act collectively to protect our sovereignty against U.S. aggression. Do you think they can or should form, for example, a NATO-style military alliance where an attack on one is an attack on all? Do you think that they should try to adopt some kind of punitive economic program to make the Americans pay a price for this aggression? What would resistance look like if these governments were willing to act collectively?
I think the first one you mentioned is probably the direction we need to be headed in. A united defense pact amongst the different countries of Latin America, where an attack on one is an attack on all. In fact, there was momentum in that direction And I think that's part of the reason why they destroyed UNASUR, the Union of South American Republics, because they started working on a made in Latin America defense strategy, made in Latin America school for military officers. So instead of being sent to the School of the Americas, they would be trained in a different kind of military doctrine, one that is not focused on repression and opening up territory to resource extraction, which is what they learned in the School of the Americas. I know it's called something else now, but who cares what they call it? Mm-hmm. But I think that's definitely the direction it needs to. I think countries in Latin America, even though we do have the Tlatelolco agreement, which prohibits nuclear weapons, should maybe revise that. Maybe that's the only deterrent you have these days. This is the world we live in. We don't live in a rules-based international order. There's nothing to turn to. The UN Secretary General can't even make a statement. So I think in a lot of ways, it's time to talk seriously about what does self-defense look like? Especially because, well, as we described, the United States still has extraordinary amount of military power and can very much carry out these kinds of operations that lead to the kidnapping of a president. So I think that's part of it. There was one really encouraging sign for me, but it's only the beginning, but it shows that there is an animus for it. The Mexican Senate was meant to hold an extraordinary session in order to allow for U.S. troops to engage in training exercises with the Mexican military and to send the Mexican military for training missions abroad. That meeting was canceled. So likely with a view to no longer being able to participate in this because there's certain timelines that make it very difficult. So the fact that it's canceled means that these training exercises are no longer going forward. That's a good start. And that needs to happen everywhere. There has to be an actual consequence to all of this because otherwise, as we said, they're just going to continue without any kind of regard for the consequences of the actions. The United States is an incredibly dangerous actor.
Let's turn to the northern part of this hemisphere. Let's talk about where I am, Canada, for a moment. I want to show you statements by Prime Minister Goldman Sachs, aka Mark J. Carney, and the leader of the official opposition, Pierre Poilievre. So here's Carney's statement, first of all, and you can see he begins by eviscerating the government of Nicolás Maduro, calling him a brutally oppressive and criminal leader. He refers to his government as a regime. He boasts about unequivocally condemning Maduro's alleged grave breaches of international peace and security, gross and systematic human rights violations and corruption. Now, I just have to pause there and say, this man, Mark Carney, is supporting in every conceivable way the crimes of Israel, the crimes of the United States, the crime. So this, for him to talk about opposition to human rights violations abroad is really an insult to our intelligence. And, he's given, the Canadian government has given nearly, I think, 25 or $23 billion to Ukraine, one of the most corrupt governments on God's green earth. So again,
when's the last time Ukraine had an election?
Exactly. Their president's term expired in May of 2024. And of course, Canada treats the autocracy of Saudi Arabia as legitimate. They treat the Egyptian dictator as legitimate, and on and on and on. But in any case, he's clearly attempting to legitimize what the United States has done by painting Nicolás Maduro as the embodiment of evil. And then he goes on with some mealy-mouthed language about Canada's long supported a peaceful, negotiated, and Venezuela-led transition, blah, blah, blah. But there's no condemnation in here of what the United States has done. And if anything, as I indicated, he's trying to legitimize it by demonizing the president whom they just kidnapped, the Americans. So that's Mark Carney. Now, here's what
something about Mark Carney. I think he is the spokesperson for the mining companies that largely run the Canadian government, that dictate Canada's foreign policy. And those companies in particular have always had it out for the Bolivarian Revolution. People in particular like Peter Monk, who way back in the early 2000s used to call for the ouster of Hugo Chavez. Why? Because he nationalized all of the gold reserves in Venezuela that these Canadian mining companies were salivating over and regret not being able to extract from that country.
Yeah, and just for people, good point. For people who don't know, Peter Monk is from the, I think he was the head honcho Barrick, the largest gold miner in the world, a Canadian corporation, which has got tremendous political power in this country. Very important point that you made, José Luis. Now let's just glance at what the leader of the official opposition, he was even more sycophantic. It was just really nauseating to read this. So Poilievre says, congratulations to President Trump on successfully arresting narco-terrorist and socialist dictator Nicolás Maduro, who should live out his days in prison. Now here this guy actually does mention Edmundo Gonzalez, even though nobody at the Trump press conference thought to even raise his name. And he says that he should take office along with the courageous hero and voice of the Venezuelan people, Maria Corina Machado. So down with socialism, long the freedom. So that's Pierre Poilievre. Now, what I want to say about this and get your thoughts on it, José Luis, is that as a Canadian, I'm going to use some strong language here, but I think it's entirely justified. And I want to say I'm not expressing a legal opinion. I'm talking here about morality, about ethics, okay? I think that these two men basically are committing treason. And I'm going to tell you why. Because Trump has been saying, without any compunction at all, that Canada, he views it as the 51st state. He's been calling our prime minister the governor. And these two clowns are basically encouraging the United States government that has directly threatened and explicitly threatened over the past year Canadian sovereignty to behave in this way, to use military force to effectively remove from power any government that doesn't do the bidding of Washington, and to rule that country, as the Americans say they're now going to rule Venezuela, from Washington. So how can you possibly claim to be a champion of Canadian sovereignty when you are effectively encouraging this country, this behemoth to the south of our border, to behave in this manner after it has threatened Canadian sovereignty? I mean, do you think that there's any merit to my critique here? Do you think that Canada is immune from this sort of criminality from the Trump regime? Or do you think there actually is a serious risk with this particular president that he may be more forceful in his pursuit of the goal of making Canada the 51st state?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, I hadn't considered the fact that this should be also understood as a warning to every single country who has been threatened by Trump, Canada included. I saw a lot of commentary around Greenland and how Greenland was going to be next. They just showed that they're willing to do anything. But you're right. And, you know, there was all this talk when Trump started going after Canada about elbows up. You know, that even made it down here to Mexico. Well, I think those elbows are all the way down now because it's by facilitating this sort of illegal action, by giving Trump essentially permission to do these kinds of actions, it puts Canada at risk. And listen, I understand that Canadians have a very different appreciation of the United States than, say, we do here in Mexico. We've been invaded by the United States. We lost half of our territory. Canadians don't seem to understand the seriousness of the threat that the United States represents. And while there may be some people who are maybe laughing at Venezuela's inability to be able to defend its territory in the face of the U.S. onslaught, Canada wouldn't be able to put up much of a fight either. That would be over in a day. And you could lose territorial integrity. That applies even to white settler countries like Canada. This is the new world we live in.
Yeah, and we are, again, I'm no military expert, but it seems to me that this country is a lot more vulnerable than Venezuela because we actually share the longest undefended land border in the world with the United States. So can you imagine if those forces came across the border? I mean, really, our pipsqueak army is going to be able to defend our sovereignty? I think that's a pipe dream.
Not to mention you rely on U.S. equipment. So they're not going to provide you with any of that equipment anymore. And I'm fairly certain that they can disable remotely much of the defense infrastructure that Canada actually would have.
100%, 100%. So last thing I want to ask you about, José Luis, is China. You know, a special envoy to Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, was meeting with Nicolás Maduro only hours before these gangsters kidnapped him. And
he was still in the country when this happened.
Do you know, by the way, if he's managed to depart the country, or is
I don't know?
Are you?
I imagine he has. I mean, I think even the United States would be careful about, you know, accidentally killing a high-ranking Chinese official.
Right. Well, the Chinese, I understand, either privately owned corporations or the state itself have invested many billions of dollars in Venezuela. I think it's quite clear that Trump doesn't want any kind of a Chinese presence anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. That's not to say that he can stop it. But how do you think based on what you've heard from the Chinese government in the past 48 hours and based on its prior interactions with Venezuela, its investments there, how do you think the Chinese government is likely to respond to this attempt to effectively seize the resources of Venezuela and destroy its sovereignty?
So I'm certainly no China expert, but I of course do follow a lot of what they have to say, especially when it comes from the Foreign Affairs Ministry. And those who are familiar with the language that China tends to use, they're very careful. They're very cautious. Even in this kind of tariff dispute that they had with the United States, they were very careful to only amplify the rhetoric at the very end of the kind of back and forth that they had to really kind of mark a very clear line that could not be crossed with them. In their statement that they released in response, they were emphatic. They were clear in their condemnation of the U.S. action and the kidnapping of Nicolás Maduro. And so I think that's really encouraging. And what is that owed to? Well, I would say on the one hand, we have to remember that, the special envoy was in Venezuela because China and Venezuela have an all-weather diplomatic relationship. So that's kind of the highest ranking there can possibly be within the Chinese system. And in fact, Venezuela is the only country, despite the fact that China is the #1 trading partner for the vast majority of Latin American countries, the only country is Venezuela to have that kind of diplomatic arrangement. Something like 90% of Venezuela's oil sales today go to China. And so that relationship is really, really important. More so for Venezuela, I think, because ultimately I think the imports that China gets from Venezuela only constitute 5% possibly of their imports of oil. Nonetheless, there is an ideological, political, diplomatic unity with the Venezuelan government, born in part because of the investments, but also because China is a global player and it has an important foothold in Latin America, and all of this is relatively new. For the longest time, the #1 trading partner almost of every single country in the region was the United States. That changed in the last 10 years. And so we've seen, more of a presence of them here as well. And so, we also saw them energetically condemn these extrajudicial executions that were happening in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific. And so I think it's important to have a global player like China speaking out against this. But also have to recognize that, China is also reticent, I think, to really kind of get involved too much in global disputes. It does play a role where it feels like it can be helpful. It'll be interesting to see what happens next in terms of, what's they're going to be positioned at the United Nations, for example, when this comes up for debate. Of course, they are also on the Security Council. So, it's kind of a wait and see, but certainly I don't think that this changes anything for Venezuela and its special relationship with China and with Russia as well. That should be said. Russia has massive investments, especially in the gas industry in Venezuela. And so, as things tend to be in this globalized economy, this becomes very much a geopolitical affair as well, with very important actors like Russia and China, which themselves have important unity between them, important agreements between them that make them a very important bloc on the global stage. And so the more condemnation we can get, I think the better, and especially from places like China and Russia.
Well, it's always a pleasure speaking with you today, José Luis, and I hope we can talk again in the days ahead. I'm sure there's going to be a lot to talk about as this story continues to unfold.
Yeah, and just as parting words, I know that certainly in my case, yesterday, I got the news at 5 a.m. I broke my hand on Friday, so I'm on a lot of painkillers, and I thought I was hallucinating. I couldn't believe it as I started reviewing everything that was happening. And it was a very dark day for me to witness, and I've done everything I can to kind of put my part in trying to denounce what's going on and speaking to anybody who asks. But I also want to end on a more optimistic note. Latin America, Venezuela, it's gone through a lot. If you can reach back into the last century, right? The left survived the brutal dictatorships of the Southern Cone. Here in Mexico, it survived the dirty war. In Colombia, we watched that video of Gustavo Petro, and he was actually speaking at an event to commemorate the political genocide of the Patriotic Union, which was a left-wing political party that was born out of a previous peace process there. They survived that. And we'll survive this. And Venezuela will survive this. And yes, there may be right now a kind of a trend to the right, but that can change. And it can change very quickly. And so I want people to understand that the night is darkest before dawn. And there has to be a sense that we will be able to overcome this because there really is no alternative. And I don't mean that in the Thatcherite sense. I mean, it really is socialism or barbarism. On the one side, you have pedophiles and genocide heirs. And on the other side, you have the people who just want welfare, who just want to live a dignified life. And there's more of us than there are of them. They have the guns, they have the technology, they have the capital, but we have the people.
Here, here. And I'm so glad you said that. You know, the overall trajectory of the events unfolding across the world today remains the same, which is the rapid decline of American power. And along the way, there are going to be battles lost, but the war will be won. I completely agree with you.